Okay. So, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for being here with us today as we continue celebrating Dr. King's legacy here at the University of Michigan. And I think we have all three campuses represented. So I won't even say at Dearborn. But we'll begin today with a land acknowledgement. So today we are gathering in the digital space, but we are being hosted by the University of Michigan in Dearborn. The University of Michigan in Dearborn sits on the territory of Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which is comprised of the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Odawa. And so with this, we begin our program with a humble acknowledgement, which aims to honor the indigenous people of the land on which the university currently resides. We do this to acknowledge, to honor, and to uplift First Peoples who stewarded these lands in the past, and to their descendants who continue to carry on their legacy in the present. To members of the Indigenous community, please know that you are not forgotten. Okay, so welcome and thank you for choosing to join us today as we continue celebrating the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today we have an exciting discussion ahead of us with two amazing scholars, administrators, and just amazing people in general. And they're going to share with us their scholarship and expertise around diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, access, and more. So my name is Gerard. I use he and him pronouns. I'm joining us today. I'm wearing two hats. So I am the Intercultural Program Manager at the University of Michigan-Dearborn at the Center for Social Justice and Inclusion. And then more recently, I became a master level student at the School of Social Work at Ann Arbor. And then I'm also the vice president of the Association of Black Social Work Students. And I want to give a shout out to my co-chairs, partners for agreeing to do this last minute. I really appreciate you guys. So those are sort of the two hats that I'm wearing. So today, here's how our program's going to flow. I'm just here to kick things off and go over a few housekeeping items. And I will provide a little bit of context around our conversation today around affirmative action bans as they relate to higher education. And then I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tabby Chavis, who will provide opening remarks and introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Luke. And then Dr. David Luke will present to us his scholarship. Once Dr. Luke has wrapped up, we'll engage in discussion and take questions from our audience. So just a few housekeeping things. The Q&A feature is active, so please feel free to post your questions there. The closed caption feature is active. If it's not, I will activate it as soon as I finish this. And then the session is being recorded and it will be posted to our CSJI YouTube account for viewing later if you're unable to remain with us for the entire program, or if you just want to share with us. And then lastly, if you're having questions, just let us know in the Q&A. Assistance is me, and so I'll do my best to remedy whatever issue you might be having, but hopefully there are none. And that's about it for our housekeeping. So just to provide a little bit of context around affirmative action bans, affirmative action originated with an executive order signed by President John F. Kennedy in 1961. These policies were established to increase racial diversity and reduce instances of discrimination in general, and to explicitly encourage colleges and universities to use an applicant's race as a factor for admissions. The goals of these policies were largely to attain a critical mass of underrepresented minority students by utilizing race as a plus factor in admissions. In 1996, a white Michigan woman with a 161 LSAT score and a 3.8 GPA was denied admissions to U of M Law School. She argued her denial was the result of affirmative action policies that favored minority applicants, and filed a lawsuit against the university, the regents, and UM leaders in position at the time of her rejection. In 2003, the case Grutter versus Bollinger was filed on the grounds of race discrimination in violation of the 14th Amendment and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The district level court determined the law school's use of race admissions was unlawful. This decision was later overturned by the Sixth Circuit Court, basing their decision on a similar case and ruling in California, which was Regents of California versus Bake in 1978. The Supreme Court would later see the case and affirm the Sixth Court's decision, effectively upholding affirmative action and race-conscious admissions in Michigan colleges and universities. But none of this will really matter because in November of 2006, a majority of voting Michiganders, 58%, passed a referendum prohibiting state education affirmative action. So essentially nullifying the ruling of the Grutter versus Bollinger case. And there was another case, which is a little bit more complex. So I won't talk about that, but there was another case surrounding undergraduate admissions and race, their race admissions policies. But then in 2003, a group called Students for Fair Admissions sued Harvard University, claiming their race-based admissions policies and programs violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In their 14th Amendment. In their challenge, they asked the courts to overturn the Grutter versus Bollinger decision. And on June 29th, 2023, last year, in a 6-3 vote, the Supreme Court held that Harvard's admissions programs, which accounted for race, violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This ruling, in essence, will overturn race-conscious admission policies and programs for higher education institutions. So I just wanted to lay that context for us so we kind of understand what led up to the overturning of affirmative action last year. And I'm sure Dr. Luke or Dr. Chavis will add as they feel necessary. So now I'll introduce Dr. Chavis and get out the way. So Dr. Tabby Chavis is the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan. She is also a professor of education and a professor of psychology. A native of Aiken, South Carolina, Dr. Chavis attended the University of Virginia, where she received her bachelor's degree and went on to earn a PhD in community psychology. Following her graduate work, Dr. Chavis entered the University of Michigan as an assistant professor and moved up the ranks to professor. Dr. Chavis has held leadership roles at the department, college, and central administration levels during her almost 24 years at U of M. Most recently, she was the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity and Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. Prior to that, Dr. Chavis served as an Associate Vice President for Research, Associate Dean for Academic Programs and Initiatives in the Rackham Graduate School, and the Chair of the Combined Programs in Education and Psychology. Across all of her roles, the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion have been central to her leadership, approaches, and practices, and infused throughout the initiatives, programs, and practices she helped to develop and implement. Dr. Chavis's experience and research activities center around 1, social identity development among Black adolescents and young adults, 2, achievement motivation processes among ethnic minority students, and 3, the measurement and impacts of diversity climates in secondary higher education settings and implications for students' academic, social, and psychological adjustment. In combination with a number of her graduate students and postdoctoral mentees, she has published extensively in these areas. Dr. Chavis's work has been supported by grants from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, National Science Foundation, and Spencer Foundation. Dr. Chavis has also served as co-director for the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context, which she co-founded in 2008, which supports research and research training of students, postdocs, and early career scholars around the positive development of diverse Black youth and family. Dr. Chavis's undergraduate and graduate teachings teaching contributions focus on developmental, psychological, cultural, and organizational processes relevant to education and youth development. Examples include adolescent psychology with a focus on context of schools, communities, and other societal institutions, community psychology, educational psychology and human development, foundations of teaching and learning, schools as organizations, race, ethnicity, and culture in education, and using social sciences to address achievement gaps or educational disparities across race, ethnicity, gender, and social class. Her research and teachings have allowed her to engage and collaborate with and mentor students from across disciplines and campus units, which is one of the things she has found most meaningful in her career. Based on her academic and scholarly work and leadership impacts, Dr. Chavis has been called on locally, nationally, and internationally to consult and collaborate in efforts to broaden access, participation, and retention and thriving in higher education, more broadly and in fields such as science, technology, mathematics, engineering, and engineering. These efforts focus on all levels of the academy, undergraduate and graduate students, postdoctoral scholars, and faculty. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chavis. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Gerard, for that warm welcome. I mean, I was like, who are you talking about? I appreciate each of you in the audience joining us today and spending your time with us. Sorry, I'm actually having some very unexpected sunshine in Michigan, so it won't last long. So the glare hopefully will go away soon. I just, really feel excited about, engaging in this multi-campus discussion today. And celebrating the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., I and probably my colleague, Dr. Luke and others on the panel would emphasize how Dr. King's birthday exemplifies the core values that we work around: diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also think, and I know a theme that will come up in our discussion today, that it's appropriate to acknowledge our current context. The active and calculated national campaigns against the values that represent Dr. King's work and legacy, those things being reflected through anti-diversity, equity, and inclusion legislation, efforts to eliminate it in teaching, learning, and policies and practices and programs that seek to advance equity and opportunity and access, such as race-conscious admissions and the like. As our nation celebrates and recognizes the importance of Dr. King's legacy, which has been the foundation of much of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work we do, those DEI values and efforts in higher education, K through 12, as well as in industry and other public sectors, are coming under huge attack. The attacks are actually framed in the guise of supporting our freedoms when they're actually quite regressive. They want to eliminate progress that we've made in education, including history, educational access, including affirmative action, as well as other areas such as voting rights, healthcare access, reproductive rights, just to name a few. These attacks also seek to stoke fears and divisions across racial, religious, and cultural communities that inhibit our ability to work together effectively. So given that, this occasion, this event, it makes it even more clear that the work we do individually and collectively to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, address anti-racism in our society is more important than ever. Institutions of higher ed must continue to speak out, act, educate, and be voices of resistance and change. Our voices and your voices are important to our universities, our collaborations with surrounding communities, and to our nation and world. And with that, I'm so excited to introduce my colleague, Dr. David Luke, Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan-Flint, who's an expert and advocate and change maker in this space. A native of Grand Rapids, Michigan, Dr. David J. Luke worked as a certified public accountant after graduating from Grand Valley State University before returning to higher education to study sociology at the University of Kentucky. Currently, Dr. Luke works as Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan-Flint, where his research broadly on multiracial organizations informs his work. Dr. Luke's scholarship focuses primarily on understanding racial diversity in higher education. In his book with Routledge titled Affirmative Action and Black Student Success, The Pursuit of a Critical Mass at Historically White Universities, he's done a mixed method cross-national study on diversity initiatives and programs at 3 universities, 2 in the US and 1 in Canada, where he looked at the impact of these initiatives on Black student enrollments and completions at the universities. State context and restrictive legislation, for instance, bans on affirmative action, had a negative impact, while desegregation mandates had a positive impact. Further, Dr. Luke's research finds that state bans on affirmative action negatively impact Black student enrollments at selective institutions only, but impacts completions at universities that are less selective as well. Finally, Dr. Luke is developing a critique of the impact of Canadian multiculturalism based on his interviews at the 3 institutions. Now, as a skilled practitioner, Dr. Luke leverages his insights in his current role in efforts to create and assess effective diversity initiatives and programs, in particular, those that improve retention and graduation rates among students of color and other marginalized groups on campus. Dr. Luke is a prominent national voice on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Having presented at the American Sociological Association, Society for the Study of Social Problems, National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education, and National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education annual meetings, as well as speaking at numerous colleges, universities, and other organizations. He currently serves on the National Advisory Council for NCORE, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity in Higher Education. And he's a part of the Chief Diversity Officer Fellowship Program for NADOE and is Vice President-elect of the Society for the Study of Social Problems. Without further ado, Dr. David Luke.
Thank you, Dr. Chavis, and thank you to Gerard and the team at the University of Michigan-Dearborn Center for Social Justice and Inclusion, as well as the Association of Black Social Workers for supporting this event, and to everyone who's in attendance today. I will talk for a while here, and then we will get, I'll be sure that we have time for the Q&A. So I will begin a little bit about me beyond the bio that was just read. You know, I am a multiracial man who presents as racially ambiguous. My dad is an Indian man who immigrated to the US from Malaysia. My mom is a Dutch-American white woman from West Michigan. And I believe that my physical appearance and experiences I've had because of this experience have led in some ways to my interest in studying race and racism. Additionally, like Dr. King, I'm motivated by an ethic due to my faith and often consider the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion as institutionalizing a love for one's neighbor. So with all that said, Dr. Chavis mentioned my book. I have the cover up here. Affirmative action, as we know it, has been under attack for some time, the last 20 years especially. Gerard highlighted one of the 2003 court cases that the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor was involved in. And with what many deem the final blow coming this past June, when the Supreme Court effectively prohibited consideration of race in admissions decisions, many predict the next blows will come to employment-related affirmative action. So here's a brief agenda for my remarks in our time together. I want to discuss Dr. King and affirmative action, talk about what systemic racism really means, briefly about affirmative action in higher education is from my book, and a little bit about some of the challenges that we see in DEI in higher education, but I think we'll get more into that in the Q&A as well. So to begin, affirmative action has been talked about a lot, but much like critical race theory and DEI, those talking about it are often unclear on what it actually is. And there are intentional efforts to mischaracterize it to generate opposition. In the mischaracterization, people sometimes invoke Dr. King as though he was in opposition to affirmative action. So many of you have probably seen or heard this quote used in the process, and some of you know what quote I'm going to show. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Right? So some will interpret this quote from the I Have a Dream speech to say that Dr. King would not support race-based affirmative action. Clearly, they argue, King would favor a colorblind and therefore fair process. I will argue this is an intentional misrepresentation. While King may indeed be advocating for a colorblind nation in the future, the path toward that future was never via colorblindness as a mean to get there. In fact, affirmative action began to be instituted under the Civil Rights Act, largely viewed as one of the major successes of the civil rights movement. There's an entirely different conversation about how symbolic legislation effectively ends public political discourse about social issues as though they're solved, but that's another topic that we won't really get into. You can take nearly any quote out of context, though, and make it mean something totally different from what it is. When we look at the life and legacy of Dr. King, affirmative action, though imperfect, was an attempt to remedy an inequity that was consistent with King's legacy. A less common quote from Dr. King's 1964 book, Why We Can't Wait, is as follows, and I'm going to read it, a longer quote. Among the many vital jobs to be done, the nation must not only radically readjust its attitude toward the Negro in the compelling present, but must incorporate in its planning some compensatory consideration for the handicaps he has inherited from the past. It is impossible to create a formula for the future, which does not take into account that our society has been doing something special against the Negro for hundreds of years. How can he be absorbed into the mainstream of American life if we do not do something special for him now? in order to balance the equation and equip him to complete on a just and equal basis. Whenever the issue of compensatory or preferential treatment for the Negro is raised, some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they agree, but he should ask for nothing more. On the surface, this appears reasonable, but it is not realistic. For it's obvious that if a man is entered at the starting line in a race 300 years after another man, the first would have to perform some impossible feat in order to catch up with his fellow runner. Other initiatives from Dr. King, like the Freedom Budget, Operation Breadbasket, and the Poor People's Campaign, were illustrative of his desire for redistributive policies to compensate for systemic oppression. So systemic oppression leads to a conversation about systemic racism. So I want to talk a little bit about what that is. And before I go into a conversation about systemic racism, one interesting thing that I learned was that on average, white parents begin talking to their children about race in the United States at around age 13. And the average age for Black parents when they begin talking about their children about race in the US is age 3. So there's a dramatic difference there in levels of comfort and experience with these sorts of conversations. I am a sociologist, which informs how I think and talk about race and racism. And you'll see that the focus is more on policies and practices that remedy racial inequity for me. So systemic racism is one form of systemic oppression, and I want to focus on that a little bit in the coming slides. So again, I said I'm a sociologist, so I have to put this slide up here, right? This is, if you took Intro to Sociology ever, then this was the thing that they hoped that you learned after that class, was to understanding the sociological imagination, the vivid awareness of the relationship between experience and the wider society. Right, so looking at private troubles in their context as public issues. I use a more recent example. If you lost your job in April or May of 2020, right, people often take job loss as some sort of personal failing. If we remember what was going on in the world in April and May of 2020, we were in lockdown due to the coronavirus, and a lot of people were losing their jobs, right? Understanding that context can impact how we understand our own job loss in that situation, right? Less of a personal failing, but also placing it within that structure. Why does sociology matter? Just a fun fact, Dr. King in 1948 got his bachelor's from Morehouse College in sociology. So as time goes by, this graph is perhaps less encouraging than I was by it at first, but what I'm looking at in this graph, I think, is useful for thinking about the sociological imagination. So two similar public opinion polls. One of them was in December of 2014. And at this time, there were uprisings going on in Ferguson, Missouri, in response to the police killing of Michael Brown. At that time, 51% of respondents said that police killing of Michael Brown was an isolated incident, and 43% said it was a sign of a broader problem. Fast forward 5.5 years, June of 2020, this was after the police killing of George Floyd, 74% of respondents saw it as a sign of a broader problem, right? And I would say those people were right. But what I was seeing there was a use of the sociological imagination by a larger proportion of the public, right? They were looking at the police killing of George Floyd, not in isolation, but understanding it as a pattern, as a recognition that there was systemic racism within the criminal justice system. And at that time, people started talking about systemic racism a lot, but I don't necessarily think that they knew what they were saying when they were using those words. So, Joe Fagan is one person who talks quite a bit about systemic racism. He's written a book called Systemic Racism, A Theory of Oppression. But he introduced the concept in his book, Racist America, Roots, Current Realities, and for Future Reparations. Fagan's book begins in the first chapter discussing the 1787 Constitutional Convention, where 55 white men in the top 2% of wealth, 40% of whom owned slaves, began developing the US founding documents and deliberately excluded 20% of the population at the time who were enslaved, as well as indigenous people and women. So Fagan argues this is systemic racism and systemic sexism and the exclusion of women, and the US was built on it. Fagan goes on to say systemic racism involves both the deep structures and the surface structures of racial oppression. It includes the complex array of anti-Black practices, the unjustly gained political economic power of whites, the continuing economic and other resource inequalities along racial lines, and the emotion-laden racist framing created by whites to maintain and rationalize their privilege and power. Systemic racism thus encompasses the white racist attitudes, ideologies, images, actions, and institutions of this society. This racism is a material, social, and ideological reality and is indeed systemic, which means that the racist reality is manifested in all major institutions. Each major part of US society, the economy, politics, education, religion, the family, reflects the fundamental realities of systemic racism. So Fagan is arguing that the US was built on a foundation of systemic racism, and that the solution to that is the need for a new constitutional convention based on the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and related documents as a starting point. This type of transformative change that is what people were advocating for when they were saying they were fighting systemic racism, but I don't think at that time, when I was hearing it all the time, that that's what people were understood it as, right? And recognizing systemic racism and looking back at our history involves an honest grappling with the history. So I like this African proverb that says, until lions have their own historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunters. Understanding systemic racism is an effort to honestly understand our history, knowing that the writers of history will frame things in ways favorable to them. I remember being taught in school that the Civil War was fundamentally about states' rights and not slavery, right? There was a group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This group was largely responsible for erecting Confederate monuments in the 1920s and 30s across the US South. And they were also at the time writing and publishing widely adopted public school history textbooks. So one of the challenges with talking about racism and talking about racism, because affirmative action is one effort to address racism, but talking about racism, you have to begin by oftentimes explaining that it's still a problem, right? So I'm going to provide some evidence of the existence and persistence of systemic racism in the US so that we have some sort of shared basis and understanding. So in employment, in 1890, 87% of Black people in the US worked as agricultural or domestic workers, and these occupations were excluded from the Social Security Act of 1935. So this was essentially a race-blind policy that had a very deliberate racially disparate impact. In politics in the 1920s, full citizenship was available to a free white person in the US. It wasn't until 1965 that a quota system based on national origin was eliminated from US immigration policy. This requirement of being a free white person led to a number of court cases where people who you would identify today as people of color were trying to make the case that they were white in order to get citizenship rights in the US. Black people in the US were not given the right to vote until 1965. This is not that long ago. In housing, redlining was a method formalized by the federal government and implemented by banks to create racial residential segregation, and was common practice until the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Which upon the passage of that act, as I alluded to earlier, basically ended the public discourse about residential segregation. And that housing, the redlining policies have had a substantial impact on the racial wealth gap, which we'll talk about in a minute. In education, the setup of public school funding on the basis of property taxes means poorer schools have fewer educational resources and offer lower quality. And because people of color broadly are disproportionately overrepresented among the poor, the impact of that is racialized. There's also a history of occupational tracking and racial tracking in schools. In terms of wealth and income, slavery and sharecropping in the South and exclusion from unions during industrialization in the North, and factors like redlining all impacted the large racial wealth disparity. For health, one example, from 1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service diagnosed and left untreated syphilis in hundreds of Black men, even though the research subjects were being told they were being treated for bad blood. This history contributes to feelings of mistrust among many Black people and other people of color for the healthcare system. The roots of modern policing trace back to slave patrols and night watches designed to control the behavior of people of color and protect the property of the wealthy, sometimes with the property of the wealthy being Black people, enslaved Black people. So when we think about systemic racism in the criminal justice system, it traces back to the roots, right? Black civil rights leaders in history were targeted by the FBI through their counterintelligence program, including Martin Luther King Jr., who we are celebrating, who had a national holiday yesterday, and who was considered the most dangerous man in the country. This is a letter, the New York Times put this out a while ago. This is a letter from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover asking Dr. King to kill himself. The letter reads, "King, there's only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You are done. There's but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." So all that stuff was old stuff. So contemporary reality, there certainly has been progress in some areas, but there's also a ways to go. So hiring and audit studies, there are a number of pretty famous studies that have shown the persistence of discrimination in the labor market. One 2004 study where researchers submitted resumes for job ads with only names of the applicants that varied between stereotypically Black or white names. A Black candidate with 8 years of experience was as likely to be called back for a job as a white applicant with no experience. And in a similar study in 2007 that included criminal justice status, white applicants with a criminal record were more likely to be called back than Black applicants without one. In politics, the U.S. Senate, there are a total of 10 people of color in the Senate, many of whom do not well represent the views of the majority of people of color in the U.S. Gerrymandering and similar practices distribute and weaken the voting power of people of color in a way that districts are drawn. In housing, although redlining was formally prohibited, we still see housing discrimination. U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2012 housing discrimination study found Blacks and Latinos experienced discrimination in roughly half of their efforts to rent or buy housing. And housing audits in various cities show Blacks and Latinos denied available housing 35 to 75% of the time. In terms of education, there was some progress immediately after 1964 of school segregation, but as of 2000, 2001, schools were more segregated and unequal than they were in 1970. Wealth gap is huge. In 2013, the median wealth of a white family was $142,000, median wealth for a Black family $11,000, and a Latinx family of $14,000. And wealth being what you own minus what you owe, right? So this isn't income inequality. This is wealth. Asians and other groups are not separately identified in the public use version of the survey that this information comes from. In terms of health, Black people in the U.S. have higher death rates than whites for 10 of the 15 leading causes of death. Life expectancy is 4 years shorter than for white people. In criminal justice, Black people are 4.3 times more likely to receive the death sentence. And Black people are about 14% of illegal drug users, 35% of arrests, 55% of convictions, and 74% of incarcerations. I didn't see the MLK symposium in Ann Arbor yesterday, but I understand they had Michelle Alexander there, and she talks about this quite a bit in the new Jim Crow. People tend to use illegal drugs about proportionately across race, right? So people of all races tend to use drugs at the same rate. But if you look at these numbers, 14% of users become 35% of arrests, 55%, 74%. That percentage really should be the same at each stage, right? The 14% of users should be the same as the percent of arrests and convictions and incarcerations. So we see inequity throughout that process. Okay, so I want to shift back to higher education as we move towards me talking about the book a little bit. So shown here is an evolution of some diversity language at different institutions. In this example, what was once an office of minority student affairs transitioned to an office of multicultural affairs, and to institutional diversity or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now we're seeing DEI under attack, right? But those of you who are familiar, you can kind of almost timestamp these different titles, how you've seen the work sort of evolve and the name change. And so I think it's interesting the level of specificity that we have at the beginning and how it sort of broadens. And I think some of this is a good thing, but the language that we use matters, right? So there's some research that's quite critical of the diversity language, noting that diversity is often framed in terms of culture, religion, experience, and other non-racial factors, going so far as to consider pet ownership as a form of diversity. Right? And if we think of diversity like that, it makes conversations about racial inequality and civil rights very difficult. And other scholars have observed that diversity hinders investigations into deeper structural inequalities in organizations and is increasingly rationalized by economic means exclusively. So some of what we're seeing now in the political environment, there's been a shift towards enforcement of anti-discrimination policies to protect white students. We've talked about the Supreme Court ruling. Diversity, equity, and inclusion being targeted by politicians and framed as inadequately protective or actively harming Jewish students. There's an argument that DEI ignores the needs of Jewish students adequately and thus exacerbates anti-Semitism. And this is not grounded in anything, right? This is a manufactured argument to generate opposition to DEI. So we see state politics, Texas, Florida. There are bills to end DEI, and there's model legislation from the Manhattan Institute that people are just filling in the blanks and submitting. State support for public education has been on a decline. And then there's this persistent criticism that colleges and universities are places where there's liberal indoctrination happening, right? And we see racial inequity across public universities. So these are national averages for 6-year graduation rates for public universities. And we can see racial disparities, right? White students tend to be have much higher 6-year graduation rates than Black and Hispanic or Latino. Okay, so that brings us to my book. So I will talk about that a bit. For context, my bio mentioned I attended Grand Valley. I attended while the affirmative action ban was going into effect. And so I was very interested in how universities were adapting to this and what the impact of such bans would be. And unfortunately, that's become something that we will see a lot more of now. So in the book, the problem that I identify as affirmative action is on the decline. Over the past 20 years, Supreme Court cases, state ballot proposals, and an executive order in Florida pushed for or succeeded in banning affirmative action. In 2006, when I was an undergraduate student, this happened in Michigan. At the university I attended scrambled to figure out how to continue to pursue diversity. The president sent a campus-wide email expressing disappointment in the proposal that 58% of the voters in Michigan supported. Now, 17 years from that ban, and after a Supreme Court ruling effectively ended affirmative action in 2023, I wondered what progress has been made and what happened at universities and states with bans in terms of Black student enrollments and completions compared to what happened in states with bans and how that compared to states without ban and to a Canadian institution. So, some key concepts. I talk about in the title of the book, historically white universities. I look at that as a parallel to the term that you might be more familiar with, historically, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, because I believe using that term evidences the intentionality of the history of exclusion of these institutions, as a predominantly white institution does not. Right, so HBCUs are looked at as Black institutions that are very deliberately centering Black students, and that is often accurate that they do center Black students. But universities that have focused historically on white, cisgender, upper middle class men are not labeled in that way, right? So understanding these as not just universities, but as historically white colleges and universities. And historically white colleges and universities as racialized organizations, right? So Victor Ray's theory of racialized organizations identifies 4 key tenets, namely that racialized organizations enhance or diminish the agency of racial groups, legitimate unequal distribution of resources, whiteness is a credential, and racialized decoupling of formal rules and organizational practices. In my book, I mentioned we can see how phenomena happen in racial groups. At HWCUs, we see that relative to students of color, they do a better job at recruiting, retaining, and graduating white students. They center white students in their policies, procedures, and practices and programming, such that white students and their behavior is accepted, and other students are punished for things as mundane as sleeping in a common area. Indeed, resources are allocated to white student organizations and offices at disproportionate rates, such that emergence of centers and offices to support marginalized students is common at HWCUs. For example, often at universities, you see the emergence of cultural centers, LGBTQ centers, women's centers, and international centers as an implicit nod to the fact that students of color, LGBTQ students, women, and international students have been underserved by the institution. Indeed, many of these cultural centers have emerged as the result of direct action from students, protests that produce these resources. Understanding HWCUs as historically white racialized organizations can explain both racial equity gaps and what sort of work is needed to remedy the gaps at these institutions. Next, excuse me, James Thomas, in his book Diversity Regimes, talks about a phenomenon of diversity's condensation, where a variety of what appear to be unrelated things are united under the banner of diversity. David Embrick notes an example that I mentioned earlier in the corporate sector, where pet ownership was listed as an aspect of diversity. This points to how the word can be so diluted that it's meaningless and it disempowers the word from any connection to justice, equity, and social change. Gordon Allport developed an influential concept called the contact hypothesis. In my book, I mentioned Allport outlines 4 optimal conditions for when prejudice reducing contact. When members are of equal status, with common goals, performing tasks that involve intergroup cooperation under the support of authorities, laws, or customs. The contact hypothesis has been the focus of criticism over the years. Some have argued that the contact hypothesis is ignorant of social norms and broader intergroup contexts, mediating intergroup effects. However, some recent research supports the claim of the contact hypothesis, going further to say that any intergroup contact, including intergroup contact without the optimal conditions present, reduces prejudice. The optimal conditions only enhance the tendency for positive outcomes to emerge. This comes from a meta-analysis with 713 samples from 515 studies. In fact, 94% of the sample net showed an inverse relationship between contact and prejudice. Additionally, one study showed that simply imagining intergroup contact could reduce prejudice. Next, the concept, colorblind racism. So colorblind racism, Eduardo Bonilla Silva argues, came about after the Jim Crow overt style of maintaining white supremacy was replaced. And he identifies major themes or frames of colorblind racism. Abstract liberalism, which is the extension of principles of liberalism to race in an abstract manner. Naturalization, which is naturalization of racial phenomena such as residential and school segregation, saying that these people just want to live by each other or attend schools with each other. This just happens naturally, right? Cultural racism is embracing cultural rather than biological explanations of people of color's inferior standings or performance in labor and educational markets. And then the minimization of racism, which is the claim that discrimination has all but disappeared. Bonilla Silva argues that whites use these frames in combinations rather than in pure form, and with differing levels of sympathy, and that the frames form an interpretive matrix from where to extract arguments to explain a host of racial issues, and a wall that barricades whites from the United States racial reality. When used together, he argues that it allows folks to blame people of color for their status and advocate for colorblind policies that don't address the structural problem. Whites can tiptoe around the most dangerous racial minefields because of stylistic elements of colorblind racism provide them the necessary tools to get in and out of almost any discussion. Okay, so very briefly, I'm exploring a few different things. I wanted to look at what the context, the impact of the context on the outcome. And so I'm measuring in this the Black students enrollments and Black student completions at 3 institutions. Actually 2 institutions, and I'll explain why that is shortly. I've talked about much of this, so I'm going to move forward. But I looked at 3 different institutions in 2 countries. A big Southern university, a Midwest selective university, and a Canadian university. And I looked at archived websites for the 3 institutions. I talked to key informants, and then I did some stats stuff. And I'm fast forwarding through that because many of you who read research articles would also fast forward through the quantitative section, I believe. So first, some findings. So first there's a structural explanation. What I found was that at Big Southern University was under a mandate from the U.S. Department of Education to desegregate because they were in violation of the Civil Rights Act. The Council of Post-Secondary Education gave specific goals related to Black student enrollments and completions. And so from 2000 to 2012, that institution saw growth in Black student enrollments and completions. And this was largely because they were under a mandate to do so, and they were being monitored for, are they doing this effectively, right? They created a President's Commission on Diversity, which implemented strategies to achieve goals, had measurable outcomes and timelines. And while the same federal laws apply to the Midwest Selective University, as a university in a northern state, they weren't under the same federal scrutiny regarding desegregation. They were taking an aggressive approach with regards to increasing Black student enrollments and completion, but was faced with a negative response and resistance in terms of lawsuits and legislation, which banned consideration of race for all public colleges and universities in admissions. This selective university was highly selective and had a legacy of social movements that was stronger than at the Big Southern University, and these factors may have increased the media scrutiny and the negative reactions. Essentially, the Big Southern University's success here was based on an externally monitored top-down approach with very little media scrutiny. The quantitative results. So what I did for the quantitative portion, I looked at public universities, and then I had a variable for whether or not there was a ban, a state civil rights initiative. And the years after there was a state civil rights initiative, there was a significant difference in Black student completions for all state universities. This is different. When we talk about affirmative action, oftentimes the focus is on very selective schools and their enrollments, right? And there is an impact there. But less has been said about other institutions, like institutions more like the University of Michigan-Flint or University of Michigan-Dearborn, right? What we've seen at those types of institutions are in states with a ban. While Black student enrollments were not impacted, Black student completions were. So something is happening as a result of this. So this partially supported one of my hypotheses as well. And other research suggested that the enrollments for the selective university were likely impacted by the state civil rights initiative as a selective institution, but that was not something that I focused on in my study. So then I looked at the websites and I talked to people, and I wanted to get a sense for how they were talking about diversity. Were they able to use that sort of specific language? Archived university websites and interviews with key informants at the university showed a difference in the way the initiatives were framed. At this Big Southern University, the desegregation mandate had concrete and explicit language in terms of requirements related to Black student enrollments at BSU. The implementation at BSU, although sometimes using broad and general language, was accountable to the explicit requirements of the mandate, and Black student enrollments and completions increased during that time. At Midwest Selective, what began as explicit became more general and vague, and corresponded with a decline in Black student enrollments and completions. Since that time, some of the people that I spoke with at that institution questioned whether the legislation was an obstacle or an excuse to rationalize inaction with regards to Black student enrollments and completion. In Canada, which I didn't talk about in the quantitative part, the language was typically absent. are general and race tended to be absent, with diversity often conceptualized in terms of internationalizing the student body. The Canadian piece is interesting, and I'll talk about it more in a minute, but essentially Canadian universities, some of them just started capturing race data for their students. So they don't have the data. And so what I argue is that the people at the Canadian institution that I talked to spoke proudly about Canada's policy, national policy of multiculturalism. And as a result, they weren't collecting race data. But when I spoke to people of color at the institution, they were describing the same sorts of racist microaggressions that we would hear about from people when we talk to them at US institutions. There's just not data to support that that's having an impact on retention or completions for students there yet. And so this multiculturalism is almost like waving a mission accomplished flag and obscuring the actual data when you speak with people about what their experience is. So yeah, racism blind multiculturalism is what I ended up calling that. So some implications for this. Context matters to a degree. So context matters, but context could also be used as an excuse. So while other public flagships in states with affirmative action bans didn't see the same declines as those at the university that I spoke with, other factors like selectivity, media scrutiny are germane to this issue. But people at that institution question the sincerity of some of the administration's efforts, right? So context matters to a degree. We work at universities. We're really smart people. We can figure out how to do stuff, right? There's some questions there. External mandates can be effective. So at the big Southern University that saw an increase in Black student enrollments and completions, this was largely due to an external mandate. And while research shows that mandatory diversity trainings can be counterproductive and generate resentment among employees at a firm, statewide mandates can have the power to force the hand of university administrators and employers in generating real change. High levels of selectivity and highly socially valued degree, high media scrutiny, and social movement activity may have all played a role in working against the more selective institution as compared to the big Southern University. And then finally, the lack of data in the data in the Canadian institution and Canadian universities broadly conceals racial disparities in enrollment and completion and other data. While multiculturalism on the surface appears to contrast colorblindness by being more color conscious, the prided position of multiculturalism associated with a lack of tracking race data for students in Canada likely serves a parallel purpose to colorblindness in preserving the racial status quo and reproducing racial inequality. So thank you. That was a lot. So I want to be sure that we have time for the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Luke. That was amazing. I have like 2 questions just off the top of my head. So what do you mean by selective? So when you say Midwestern selective, like what's the selective piece versus just the big university, big Southern university? Like yeah.
The selective university is an elite, prestigious university that is difficult to get into.
Okay, so not
all... admissions selectivity is what I'm referring to.
So is that different from just other schools that just let everyone in? Like, I guess.
Yes, that is. A lot of schools are less selective, and it's partly because, so, you know, when I think of the University of Michigan, and we have all campuses represented here, right? Mm-hmm. The campuses serve different purposes, right? So in Ann Arbor, we have one of the world's leading research institutions that is generating new knowledge, and it's hard to get into, right? As a state university, there's some obligation to the residents of the state to provide access to higher education, right? And so I think our campuses provide complementary services in that way that maybe someone who doesn't quite meet the admissions requirements in Ann Arbor could go to Flint or Dearborn and get a Michigan degree and go on to do very well, right? And so that's sort of, in a way, differentiation.
Yeah. Thank you. So yeah, to the audience, the Q&A feature is active. Definitely feel free to ask us questions. I have a few to kick us off. I'll ask Dr. Chavis, is there any burning questions that you might have or anything that you want to kick us off with, or no pressure?
Yeah, I'm eager to jump into your questions and to the attendees' questions. So let's do it.
Okay. Well, seeing as there are no attendee questions at this moment, we'll start with one of my first questions, which is, what is the state of DEI in the context of the university, specifically the University of Michigan, and then more generally in higher education, and then in broader society from either of you guys' perspectives?
Well, I'll jump in there. I mean, I will say that, I'll speak both at the level of the campus that I work with, as well as kind of what I see happening as I talk to other leaders at our university and nationally. I think at U of M, certainly on our Ann Arbor campus, I would say that the state of our diversity efforts are really are positive. They're moving forward powerfully. And we're also facing critical challenges that are being faced across the nation. And so, in terms of the positive aspect of that, I can say that, as an example, on the Ann Arbor campus, we just launched our second diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, DEI 2.0, in the fall. And that was really based on the outcomes, learnings, progress, and promising models of the effort in the prior 5 years. The purpose of that effort was to have the whole campus own the diversity, equity, and inclusion plan and not just be situated in my office or in a central office. So it was really taking advantage of the fact that we have a decentralized campus and culture, and a lot of heterogeneity across units. So the challenges and the opportunities for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the College of Engineering are not the same as the School of Nursing, which are not the same as in student life or budget and finance. But all of those areas have something to do with the ways that we address diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for us on the Ann Arbor campus, that's 51 different either academic or administrative and service units. And so we asked each unit to develop a plan. Tell us what your stretch goals are, because it can be easy for our units to say, well, central administration doesn't understand us. That's true. So help us understand you by telling us what your challenges and opportunities are. What data or information do you have that helps us understand, what your challenges are and why, and then that will drive the actions that you are proposing. And then what indicators and metrics will you use to know that you're making progress? It can't be, we felt we did a good thing when we had that seminar or symposium event. What have you done that then leads to measurable outcomes for the constituencies that you serve? And in some cases, that's student-facing, staff, faculty, alumni, patients. So we really cross-cut all the kind of areas of the campus. And that really has created a sense of kind of ownership versus, somebody needs to do that DEI work. That is the work, of the units, and that each unit actually has expertise that we don't have, about that operation or those functions that should be critical to their solution building. And we also bring the leaders from those units together so that we can share what they're learning, share practices, share lessons learned, frustrations, stumbling blocks as well. I'll also just situate that, really positive work, which has actually led to a number of kind of measurable outcomes related to our student, staff, and faculty demographics. So, who we are, in terms of our demographic representation across a broad range of identity characteristics. Some of the indicators that we're going in the right direction with regard to climate, and even or illuminating spaces, where there are climate challenges and where there are really strong positive climates on our campus, and using that positive peer pressure, hey, you say it can't be done, it can be done over here. And, and here's how they're doing it, using inclusive workplace practices, for instance. So there are a lot of different outcomes that we're able to show related to our students, our faculty, and our staff, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But even in the face of that, we're experiencing challenge, as David said, and as I kind of led with, and as we chatted with you about, Gerard, there's an anti-DEI movement happening, and some of our states are actively legislating policies. David, gave us a nice outline. We had a course today, which was so exciting. I'm still geeked, after hearing your talk, David, about policies to eliminate DEI initiatives, those that suppress free speech, pit DEI against free speech. That's what's causing these problems. Debates about what should be included in DEI work. So even though some of that began in K through 12 with, eliminating African-American history from the curriculum, not focusing on any knowledge about LGBTQ plus communities, that those spaces have also impacted higher ed. And we see, universities shuttering their offices or changing their names, or, moving people to other spaces so that they're not, focused on DEI explicitly. They're, based on this premise that it is causing harm or lacks educational or intellectual value. And so even though Michigan, I will say, we're not in a state yet, I mean, election season is coming, where that legislation has been passed, we feel those pressures. So we, our leadership gets those questions, from both, at the congressional federal kind of level, because those arguments are starting, and you saw some of it play out, have seen some of it play out in recent months, in higher education, and on our campus, this kind of miseducation around what DEI is. It's for one group. It's only, unearned privileges for one group. Usually it's about race, and usually it's about Black people. But not always. And sometimes it's, entitled groups that have unearned privileges. That it's not actually working on access and opportunity, but that it's just indoctrinating people in certain ways of thinking. And so, again, David outlined some of this really, really well in his talk. And I want to say, just as a kind of compliment to the positive kind of picture that I gave about what's happening on our campus, is that, we've had to really message to our campus that we cannot be complacent. That we are one election, one, step away from being pushed in the same direction as the other, states that we have seen, this happen in, and that the only thing that has a chance of preventing it is that our community continues to raise their voice, and insist to our institutional leadership that this is a priority and a value, and also tells that are able and have the language, which is part of what we're helping with, has the language to actually tell our leaders why it's helpful, so that we are really, countering that miseducation, that seeks to make DEI everything that you fear. Like, we don't want to define it because we want to make it anything you don't like. If you fear something, if you are uncomfortable, that means it's the DEI's fault. And so we have to do a lot of counter work in our communities to be able to change that narrative, to flip the narrative. And we're in for more of that as the election season, has begun to kick off. So I'll stop there for the moment, pass the mic to David, who really already so well spoke to some of these dynamics.
Thanks. Yeah, so I was asked by one of the deans not too long ago if they have a donor that says they want to stop giving money because the institution is investing in DEI, how might they respond? And I said, I bet that person thinks DEI is you get a bunch of people in a room and they say, hey, white guys, you're bad, right? And if that's the case, yes, you should not give money to something that's doing that, right? That's not what it is. They don't know what it is. So if we talk about our peer mentorship program, if we talk about our support for inclusive teaching and some of the initiatives that are happening through DEI, then maybe that person actually realizes that they don't oppose it, right? But they've been made to oppose a thing that they don't actually know what it is. And this is similar to when we talk about affirmative action, and very similar to this coordinated attack on critical race theory that was not that long ago, right? So for me, I mean, there's a part of me that thinks these are, I don't know what the next target's going to be. It's DEI right now, but these things continue to move. Being a part of the University of Michigan, it's helpful. You referenced the Grutter and Gratz cases, and the University of Michigan has been one of the institutions, if not the institution, at the forefront of advancing the argument, evidence-based argument of the academic benefits of diversity and how diversity and excellence go hand in hand, right? The university cannot be excellent without being diverse. These things are intertwined. And so I think that is important for us all to understand and be able to articulate as well. When Tabby talks about how the work is sort of decentralized and diffused in these different areas, that's also protective, right? So if my job title doesn't necessarily have diversity, equity, and inclusion in it, but some of my duties are related to that, then when they ask me for all of my DEI budget, so they can say this institution is spending so much on this, it becomes harder to do because that's a part of everybody's work and everybody's budgets, and I can't just give you that piece of information that you want to get mad about, right? So I think it is important for all the members of the university community to understand what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, and that can help protect against some of this. But again, I think the advice to not be complacent is really important because we are in a state that at the moment, we don't have any active legislative threats, but things change very rapidly.
Thank you both for those very detailed responses. It kind of elicits some sub questions, but I do want to acknowledge our audience. So I'll just ask really quickly. Dr. Luke, you mentioned the Manhattan Institute in your talk, and I'm like, what is our Manhattan Institute? Is it the scholarship coming from universities, but then also who are we? You know, I don't know if you can answer that.
Tabby, do you have a thought? I'm processing it. I want to see if you have an immediate.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure I understand your question, Gerard, about, when you say that, there, Manhattan Institute, they're, institutes and foundations that, have particular focus areas,
Yeah,
things,
like very specific goals.
research, they have particular goals. I think one way that we have combated that, and I would say, when we did have success in the early 2000s around those initial Supreme Court cases around affirmative action, we brought together collaboratives of faculty, scholars, legal experts, in these spaces. And so we didn't have one institute, but because of the capacity of a large university and the relationships we have with scholars and experts and policymakers nationally, we were able to be a part of collaboratives that then took a particular set of question spaces. For instance, the question that became kind of the crux of the successful court cases, and that continues to be kind of a guiding premise for Michigan, is that diversity of perspective, diversity of background and pathway can be linked explicitly to academic excellence. And, that's in the classroom, that's in problem solving in groups, that's in the science space. And so we were able to bring, and, but the we is really, being actually on the ground driven. So we actually had, faculty, community members, who, worked on the ground together, but also asked leadership for support. So, for instance, on my campus, the National Center for Institutional Diversity was founded, after the Supreme Court cases, based on community recommendations, but supported by the president and then the provost office at that time, to bring together to create a center that was about how scholarship can be impactful on important social issues. So we have the capacity in universities to bring together kind of collectives, collaboratives, groups to be both proactive and responsive to these critical social issues, including challenges to the value of higher education and the values that we know make it better.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about the Manhattan Institute and the model legislation they're putting forward, and it's going to the House of Representatives, so much of what we can do as educators is correct some of the misconceptions that the opposition is based on. And to the degree that we can do that effectively and communicate that out, and not just among each other, but communicate it outwards, those people who are elected to represent us, right, if they are doing their jobs correctly, will represent our views. And if we can correct misconceptions, then that will make it more difficult for some of these legislations that are based on intentional misinformation to go through.
Yeah, and I will just add to that that communication strategy has to be, I mean, David hit it on the head. It can't be scholars talking to themselves. It has to be, for instance, in the current challenges that we're facing, that I'm working closely with our university development because they're, current and prospective donors who are saying, I read this article that DEI is ruining higher education and that Michigan is just doing too much and wasting all this money, indoctrinating people. What should I think about this? So I have to be able to translate that research that nobody, these are not folks who are going to read 40-page articles, to be able to translate that research to not only, the classroom space, but to, different, areas of our institution. So people who are working with our donors, people who are working with parents who are like, I heard this thing about Michigan, people who are working with, including our central administrators who, may not have expertise in this particular area and, may be a part of networks of leaders and donors and other, and also, legislators who, may have this misinformation as well too. So I think a big part of what we can do at our university is, be very strategic about messaging this to our different communities, understanding that everyone doesn't start from the same place in terms of what they know about DEI. Sometimes you have to do the DEI 101. And then for others, there's a more advanced understanding. And so you would engage with those communities in a different way. It's really important work because we can't assume that people will understand this, and there's active effort to, make people understand incorrectly.
Thank you both. Wasn't trying to throw you guys a curveball. I was just like, what's on my mind?
Hey, we're here for the discussion.
So thank you. So I'll jump over to some audience questions. We have a few here. First question from Simone, my colleague. Hi, Simone. Thanks for asking the question. Do you have strategies we can use to resist gaslighting when having conversations about affirmative action? I think you guys are kind of just touching on it, like the communication pieces.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, knowing enough about it to be able to call folks out when they're doing that and correct gently, or I mean, depends how they're approaching it, but be able to correct them, right? And give what it actually is, what it's actually doing, correct those, because the misconceptions are rampant and wide ranging.
Yeah, and I will just say, I mean, even though in Michigan we have had a ban on race-conscious admissions since 2006, that there is still, again, going back to the active miseducation. So I think there's both, unintended confusion and intentional confusion about it too. So one of the things that I felt that people in my community, meaning our campus and those who are working on admissions at the undergrad and grad level, were being kind of gaslighted on was like, oh, that policy means that you can't even say the word race or gender and the like too. That so there, so I end up spending a lot of time saying like there are literally only two things that you can't do. You can't admit someone because of their race. You can't give them funding, like, scholarship because of their race. So if you know the two things that you can't do, we're creative people. If we know the rules, then we know how to do things that, walk up to the line without crossing the line. That means we can think about things like geography. We can think about, schools or communities that have been historically underserved, that we can create outreach approaches that target particular communities that are likely, to be, to have populations that would be, underserved and, underrepresented in our institutions too. There are lots of things we need to reach out earlier and create partnerships with families and schools and communities. We can do all of those things legally. The other piece to David's point about, the wrongness is that, affirmative action was never intended to, support admission or hiring of unqualified people. So we have to say that over and over. Actually, it's about excellence, getting rid of things that kept people who had qualifications and competencies and talent away. And so I think, just being explicit. Often when people say, oh, it's unfair, I ask them like, oh, so what do you think it is? And you get some of that implicit thinking then. And so, kind of those two areas about educating on what it is and what it isn't. And also with regard to the actual law, people feeling clear that there are really a couple of things you can't do because people have been kind of fooled into being paralyzed. Like, hey, you can't even say anything about race or gender. We can't even talk about it in this search committee or in this admissions discussion. And that's actually not true. And I think the more communication we can do about the truth, and forcing those who actually say those untruths to say, where'd you get that from? In fact, and sometimes they get it from other people who are actually, oh, my department director told me that, and that could be true. And so it really is like, kind of deeply seated, this kind of intentional and unintentional confusion.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Tabby's point, one of the mistakes I would say is a mistake that I've seen is people preemptively responding to a new restriction that does not impact them yet, right? So recently in one of the universities in Arkansas, they disbanded their DEI office and tried to diffuse the work to different units. Now, the second part of that's not bad, right? But you didn't have to get rid of the DEI office because you were just predicting that that's going to happen, and it might not. And I think we need to use all the tools that are available at our disposal. And the other thing is that when people accuse affirmative action of being unfair, okay, perhaps. When you take it away, it's not fair, right? This is part of the point of the slides on systemic racism. We've talked about these audit studies, and you're hiring unqualified candidates. You're more likely to hire unqualified white candidates in some of these studies, or underqualified, if you're hiring a white candidate with no experience versus a Black candidate with 8 years of experience, right? And so this is an effort, albeit imperfect, perhaps flawed, to level a playing field that we know is not level. So, and the other thing is that people can react against things when they name race. But to my point about historically white colleges and universities, when you just call them universities, there's nothing to react against, right? But we know that those universities, if they were built primarily to cater to white, cisgender, heterosexual students, that those students are advantaged by the status quo operation of those organizations. So nobody's reacting to it because it's not named. It's the compensatory things that we have to sort of name what they're doing, and then people react to it like, oh, you said race, that's racist, right?
Thank you, guys. Next question from our audience. I think Dr. Shavers, you kind of touched on this a little, but given the inequalities in the K-12 education system, how are our campuses working to try to ameliorate these inequities with respect to educational opportunities around race, socioeconomic status, and disability status? And I can say for me, I'm not a diversity officer, but opening up programs, because we are a public institution. So I try like this event is open to the public. And I try to involve community as much as I can, even though I'm in a student-facing role, but I do acknowledge the fact that we do receive public dollars, and as much as it's appropriate, try to invite the public here on campus, which sometimes can be a little disruptive, but it also makes things a little fun. That's just my little piece there.
So, I mean, a few things. I think when I arrived here and I went to our office, one of our websites of our office that's supposed to engage with some of the K-12 districts, what I found was most of the districts that we had partnerships with were outside of Flint. We're in Genesee County, but outside of Flint in predominantly white suburbs, right? There have been more deliberate efforts to build relationships with the schools in our immediate vicinity, which are in the Flint community schools and other schools in the area, as well through the Gear Up program that we have. We have a relationship with Beecher. We've also expanded to Hamilton and are looking at other schools within the area. So I think sometimes for some of our institutions, we we haven't put forth a ton of effort. But when we're looking at, you know, one of my early on meetings when I arrived here was with a dean in the College of Health Sciences who was lamenting that the lack of racial diversity in her programs, and that she was training clinicians that would go out into the Flint community and interact with a population that looks very different from our student population. And there are pipeline issues, right? And so the solutions are longer term, but they involve our universities being more actively involved in supporting those K-12 districts. And in Flint, you know, the college-going population is about 12% of the Flint population has a bachelor's degree. This is pretty low, but it makes sense given that for much of Flint's history, you graduate from high school, you get a job for GM, you work 40 years, you retire, you have a comfortable life, right? They didn't need it. So showing the benefit of the university and also that we want you, right? These things mean something, that the students will start to visit campus in elementary and middle school, see themselves maybe there, right? We want to be a part of that sort of transition. And so that families realize when their kid is going after high school to the university and not out into the workforce making money, that this is a worthwhile investment and that they can see some benefits from that.
Yeah, and I would just echo in lots of ways what Dr. Luke what David said here, and I would just have some examples from our own campus is, we are a public institution, with an obligation to, responsibility to serve, the public good, and that includes Michigan, and even more broadly. So an example of a program, that has come out of our DEI work is Wolverine Pathways. And it is a program that's about acknowledging the fact that talent is everywhere, but the resources and opportunity structures are not. And so it's specifically intended to support, it was piloted with 3 different, kind of catchment areas in Michigan, the Detroit area, Southfield, and Ypsilanti, working with local schools, with families, with youth, starting in the 7th grade to provide those exposures to, the different kind of possibilities, in a 4-year college pathway, to provide exposures to the faculty and projects. So what does it look like to do artistic work, art and design work? What does it look like to do STEM work and engineering? What does it look like to do, urban planning? What does it look like to do, chemistry? And from the humanities to all the way into kind of the STEM fields, and to also partner to provide concrete resources. So supplementary academic resources, so we have resources and expertise here that we should be partnering and sharing with local communities. And in a 5-year period, that program is about supporting students all the way to admissions to U of M, and then once they're admitted, they get a free ride. And we've had students matriculate to the Ann Arbor, Dearborn, and Flint campus, which we mark those all as indicators of success. And in the first 5 years of the program came to account for 20% of the in-state Black students at the U of M Ann Arbor campus. And these are students who either may not have been, seeing U of M as a possibility before, or who may have had a perception of U of M as not including or caring about students from their community, because they didn't see students either from their racial group and or from their particular community or school entering U of M. Like, U of M was seen as a place for others. And so that's to us, that's not the end, it's the start, because that model is something that we think can be an effective model to scale up across more communities, across more spaces. And it requires us to provide, supports that, are not present in the K-12 schools sometimes because of inequalities in public school funding, that are, community-based and, income-based, in that space. So that's just an example of the kinds of things that we must do more of in order to really use our positionality as a public university, to support to access for those that are most underserved.
Thank you both. So we're almost at time. I think we can squeeze in maybe two more questions. So I'll ask this one really quick. What specifically can I, as a student, faculty, and staff member, do to support DEI on my own campus? So I guess we can take it as, what can students, faculty, and staff members do to support DEI on their campuses?
Yeah, I would just say there's so many answers to that. I'll just, throw in a few and give David a chance to, jump in there too. Is that, one, don't know which, campus that you're thinking about, but it doesn't matter, from one perspective, is that really, try to get a sense of what is happening on your campus, in terms of the kinds of activities and actions that are happening. The good and the bad is that we have work and need everywhere. So if your passion is like, oh, I like to work on things that relate to students in the classroom, find out what your institution is doing in those spaces. And there may be, for instance, on our campus, there's, an effort to support faculty becoming more knowledgeable and inclusive and equity-oriented kind of instructional approaches, that there's, advocacy work that students are doing around leadership. So we have, for instance, a new interfaith, intercultural engagement initiative that's about students having conversation and dialogue across difference too. We have, work that's about, policies and practices of hiring and the like too. And so if you're a faculty in your academic department, advocating for inclusive hiring training that might be happening in your department, because those evidence-based practices around avoiding bias and creating review structures that mitigate bias can be quite important. So you can be directly hands-on, or you can advocate from your role around things that that others, evidence-based practices that others have used too. But I would say start with what your institution might be working on, because you can plug into activities and efforts, that might be happening on your campus. And there's often, offices, resources, and people that you can connect with and collaborate with on them. Again, the good and the bad of it is that, we have so many areas that need to be worked on. Match it with your passions and interests, and go from there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, my first thought was, look at what's going on, get involved where it makes sense. You have representation from each campus of people who have some idea of some of the things going on and could help connect you. And also, I'm always looking for information about how people are experiencing the institution. So if you have a negative or positive experience, if you have a positive experience somewhere that we can try to scale larger, or if you have a negative experience that we need to address, if you have an idea, right? We are much better as a collective when we generate ideas for how to solve some of these problems that we're facing. So I think on mine, as thrilling as it sounds to look at the DEI strategic action plan for U of M Flint, that might be a place that you look and say, like, hey, what are we doing in these areas? Are there things we could or should be doing that you think of? Right. Yeah, get involved. And then also, I think, know what it is so that you're sort of prepared for if you're hearing people who are expressing opposition to DEI that's based on misinformation, you can say, well, actually, here are some of the things that we're doing here. And it's not what you think, and it's not accurate the way you've characterized it.
Thank you guys both. Is it okay if I ask one more question, or do we want to wrap up right now? Okay. What can I'm a big fan of the historical perspective. What can history teach us about this moment of anti-progress, anti-DEI, anti-CRT? Because history seems to be cyclical, right? And so how can we be preparing ourselves for this latest wave of anti-ness? How can we buff our spirits, our minds, our bodies?
One of the things that I think about is that the opposition, to your point, right, sort of things swing back and forth, and I think the opposition happens when you are shaking up the status quo at some level, right? And that is what DEI is supposed to do, because if we're talking about institutions that weren't built to be inclusive as we understand inclusion now, then the work that we're doing is going to make some people uncomfortable to the extent that they're comfortable with business as usual, right? Because we're challenging some of the ways that we do things in order to get better as an institution, really. So I think, you know, at some level that is something to take comfort in, is that the opposition can indicate that we're making some progress as well. If we weren't, then nobody would have any issues with it.
And I would just say encouraging, you know, a historical lens. I mean, so if you actually don't take a historical lens, you could be quite panicked, to David's point, about, you know, the resistance that you're seeing. But if you actually understand it as a part of an arc of history, like actually, you know, the resistance means that you're shaking up something, that you're doing something. Historically, you see the, you know, 4 steps forward, you know, some 2 steps back, but the net change is still positive. When we continue to be persistent in the work. History can also help us understand strategy. You know, that, you know, we should not be depending on ourselves to just like make it up in our head that there have been leaders and brilliant strategists before us who have, you know, engaged, you know, the civil rights movement, which many people reference, realize that those were not just, you know, emotional, active, like committed, passionate kids. They studied. They studied other social movements and the like too. And so, you know, current activists we engage in, a lot of students on our campus, we, you know, been engaging them in about do that homework. It's not because we're saying that old folk know it better. In fact, you know, youthful perspectives has always been, you know, critical to social change, but we can also learn a lot about strategy by understanding kind of, you know, the components of resistance and social movements that, you know, do cross-cut time, that if we know about them, that can actually help us inform our strategy. Even using new tools, we can draw on those lessons in some powerful ways. So we should all be students of history for those of us who are trying to do this kind of active action and change work in higher ed and beyond higher ed.
All right. Thank you guys for letting us go a little bit over. Dr. Luke, thank you for your work and scholarship. Appreciate you so much for presenting here. Dr. Chavis, thank you for taking the time to be here, to be in conversation with us and share your knowledge and expertise. We're going to wrap up. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for staying and engaging with us in this critical discussion. Like I said, this will be recorded and posted to our YouTube playlist. I will actually email out the playlist, and I'll also email the link to Dr. Luke's book as well once we have all that uploaded. For those of us in Dearborn, our week of MLK celebration continues. With Thursday, we have a peace rally. We will not be marching. We will just be kind of going over to Henry Ford College, but we'll send updates out about that. So yeah, so thank you guys for being here. Please stay warm. Dr. Luke, Dr. Chavis, please have a good day. I appreciate all of you. And thanks. Stay warm, people.